In the autumn of 1985, Michael Chun worked the graveyard shift at a 7-Eleven on Wisconsin Avenue in Bethesda, Maryland, 3 blocks from the District of Columbia border. The store occupied the corner of a strip mall, flanked by a dry cleaner that closed at 6 and a shuttered hardware store, whose windows had been soaked over since July. Michael was 23 years old, a Georgetown University dropout who had abandoned pre-med after his father's printing business collapsed. He wore the same orange and green polo shirt 5 nights a week, restocked cigarettes behind bulletproof glass, and mopped floors that never quite lost their sticky film of spilled soda and tracked in autumn leaves. His shift began at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. 8 hours of fluorescent-lit solitude, interrupted only by insomniacs buying coffee, taxi drivers purchasing energy drinks, and the occasional drunk stumbling in for chips. He was, by every measure, utterly ordinary, a young man treading water in the shallows of adulthood, waiting for direction that never seemed to arrive. What Michael Chun did not know, what he could not have known as he stood behind that counter sorting coins and watching. The sodium vapor streetlights cast amber pools on the empty parking lot, was that his store had been carefully selected. The location was not random. Wisconsin Avenue formed a major artery between downtown Washington and the affluent Maryland suburbs where diplomats, Pentagon officials, and intelligence analysts lived in colonial homes behind manicured hedges. The strip mall's position, 3 blocks from the Maryland border, placed it in a jurisdictional gray zone where local police presence was thin and FBI surveillance resources were spread across dozens of higher priority locations. The store, as 24-hour operation, provided perfect cover for meetings that needed to occur in the dead hours between midnight and dawn, when legitimate customers were few and security camera coverage of the surrounding area was inconsistent. Most importantly, the store was staffed by a single employee during the overnight hours, a cost-cutting measure by a franchise owner who calculated that theft losses would be less expensive than paying a second worker. This meant no witnesses, no colleagues who might notice patterns, no one to observe the quiet transactions that would soon begin occurring beneath those fluorescent lights. The first envelope arrived on a Wednesday in late October. Michael was restocking the magazine rack when a man in his late 40s entered the store. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a dark suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, despite the wet leaves tracked across the parking lot outside. His hair was silver at the temples, cut in the conservative style favored by government workers and corporate attorneys. He moved through the aisles without browsing, picked up a copy of the Washington Post, and approached the counter with the steady, unhurried gait of someone performing a routine errand. When Michael rang up the newspaper 35 cents, the man placed $2 on the counter and said, in a voice that carried no accent, but somehow seemed carefully neutral, "Keep the change." And this, he slid a white business envelope across the counter, the kind used for formal correspondence, with no writing on the exterior. "Someone will come by tomorrow night to pick it up. Just hold it behind the counter. There's $20 in it for you when you hand it over." Before Michael could respond, the man turned and walked back into the October darkness, the electronic bell above the door chiming his departure. Michael stood holding the envelope. It was sealed, slightly thick, perhaps containing several sheets of paper. The weight suggested quality stationery, not the cheap copy paper used for grocery lists. He turned it over in his hands, looking for any identifying marks, finding none. $20 represented nearly 3 hours of his wages before taxes. His student loan payment was due in 2 weeks. The envelope felt ordinary in his palm, completely unremarkable, yet something about the transaction sat uneasily in his mind. The man's phrasing had been specific, not, "I'll be back tomorrow," but "someone will come by." 2 different people. The man had made no eye contact, offered no explanation, provided no name. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 45 seconds, executed with the efficiency of a rehearsed routine. Michael slipped the envelope under the counter, beside the boxes of Marlboros and cartons of lighter fluid, and tried to return his attention to the magazine rack. But for the rest of the shift, he found his eyes returning to that space beneath the counter, to the white rectangle of paper sitting in the shadows. The pickup occurred exactly as promised. Thursday night, 2:47 a.m., according to the digital clock above the cigarette display, a woman entered the store. She was younger than the first man, perhaps mid-30s, dressed in a navy blue raincoat with the collar turned up against the November cold that had arrived overnight. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup that Michael could discern. She purchased a pack of Trident gum spearmint, and as Michael made change, she said quietly, "I believe you have something for me." Her voice was flat, neither friendly nor hostile, carrying the same carefully neutral quality as the man from the previous night. Michael retrieved the envelope from beneath the counter and handed it across. She placed a $20 bill beside the register, took the envelope without opening it, and left. The entire exchange consumed less than 60 seconds. Michael watched through the plate glass window as she walked to a dark sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, beneath a burned-out streetlight, and drove away, heading south toward the district. For 3 days, Michael thought about calling the police. He counted the $20 bill repeatedly during slow hours, holding it up to the light as though it might reveal some hidden message or counterfeit marking. The money was genuine, crisp, possibly fresh from a bank. He rehearsed conversations in his mind, imagining how he would explain the situation to a police officer or FBI agent. But each imagined conversation led to the same problem. He had done nothing illegal. A man had asked him to hold an envelope for 24 hours. Another person had collected it. There had been no drugs, no stolen property, no explicit criminal activity. He was merely a temporary custodian of correspondence between two strangers who apparently preferred not to mail their communications through the postal service. Thousands of such transactions occurred daily in cities across America. People using retail workers as informal message services, avoiding the delay and uncertainty of mail delivery. The transaction was unusual, perhaps, but not criminal. By Sunday, Michael had convinced himself that the incident was isolated, a one-time arrangement that would not repeat. On Tuesday of the following week, the man in the charcoal coat returned. Same time approaching midnight. Same newspaper, the Washington Post. Same white envelope placed on the counter with the same careful absence of explanation. "Tomorrow night," he said, sliding $2 across the laminate surface. "20 for you when it's picked up." This time, Michael opened his mouth to ask a question, to request some explanation or context, but the man was already moving toward the door with that same measured, unhurried pace. The electronic bell chimed. The parking lot swallowed him. Michael was left holding another sealed white envelope, identical to the first in size and weight, in complete anonymity. The pattern established itself over the following 8 weeks. Every Tuesday, between 11:45 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., the man in the charcoal coat would arrive, purchase the same newspaper, leave the same white envelope. Every Wednesday, between 2:30 and 3 a.m., the woman in the navy raincoat would collect the envelope, leave $20, depart without conversation beyond the minimum required for the transaction. Michael began anticipating the arrivals, watching the clock as midnight approached on Tuesdays, as 2:30 neared on Wednesdays. The routine acquired the weight of ritual, the predictability of a metronome. He stopped questioning it. The extra $80 per week, 40 per envelope, 2 envelopes weekly, represented a significant increase to his income. He paid his student loan on time. He bought groceries beyond instant ramen and peanut butter. He told no one about the arrangement, not his roommate, not his mother in Silver Spring, not the day shift clerk who relieved him at 7 a.m. The envelopes became part of his shift routine, as ordinary as restocking coffee filters or replacing the receipt paper in the register. What Michael Chun did not know was that he had become a component in a Soviet intelligence operation designated Glass Window by the KGB First Chief Directorate, managed from a restricted suite on the third floor of the Soviet Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue, exactly 2.3 miles north of his 7-Eleven store. The operation had been running for 18 months before Michael's involvement, coordinating the activities of 3 active KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover and 4 agents recruited from within the American intelligence community. The envelopes Michael handled contained no classified documents. Soviet intelligence had learned through bitter experience that physical transfer of stolen materials presented the highest risk of exposure. Instead, the envelopes contained instructions written in simple code, meeting coordinates, dead drop locations, and payment schedules for sources who had already transferred their intelligence through separate, more secure channels. The 7-Eleven served as a cutout, a break in the chain that prevented direct contact between KGB officers and their recruited agents, making surveillance detection significantly more difficult for FBI counterintelligence teams. If either the drop-off or pickup was followed by FBI watchers, the chain would break at the store, at a location so public and innocent that no case could be built from the evidence. The store's location also allowed the KGB to verify they were not under surveillance. The straight, well-lit approach from either direction on Wisconsin Avenue made counter-surveillance relatively simple. If they detected FBI watchers, they simply drove past without entering, and the operation could be postponed without compromise. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came in January 1986, during a winter storm that buried the Maryland suburbs under 8 inches of snow. Michael arrived for his shift to find the parking lot unplowed, his car fishtailing through the accumulated drifts, tire tracks carving dark wounds through the pristine white surface. The store was empty when he unlocked the door at 10:45 p.m., the interior temperature hovering near 60 degrees because the heating system struggled against the cold pressing through the poorly insulated walls. He started a fresh pot of coffee and settled behind the counter, assuming the weather would keep customers away and anticipating a quiet shift spent reading the paperback thriller he had brought from home. The man in the charcoal coat did not arrive at midnight. Michael watched the clock. 12:15, 12:30, 12:45. The parking lot remained empty, undisturbed snow reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights. At 1 a.m., Michael convinced himself the weather had disrupted the schedule, that the pattern would resume the following week. At 1:30, a sedan pulled into the lot, tires crunching through fresh snow, and for a moment, Michael expected the familiar figure to emerge. Instead, a different man entered the store, younger, perhaps 30, wearing a black parka and jeans, no suit, no polished shoes. He approached the counter directly, without pretense of purchasing anything, and said in a voice carrying a faint accent Michael could not immediately place, "Where is it?" Michael's stomach contracted. The man's eyes were wrong, not hostile, exactly, but sharp, alert in a way that suggested training and discipline. "Where is what?" Michael managed, his voice cracking slightly. The man leaned forward, gloves leaving damp marks on the counter. "The envelope." "It was supposed to be here." Michael shook his head. "Nobody left anything tonight." "The weather." The man's jaw tightened. "This is not acceptable. You will call this number if anyone else comes asking questions." He placed a business card on the counterblank white cardstock with a phone number printed in black ink. No name, no company, no context. "You will call immediately. Do you understand?" Michael nodded, though he understood nothing. The man turned and left without purchasing anything, his boot prints marking a straight line from door to car through the undisturbed snow. Michael spent the remainder of the shift staring at the business card. He had witnessed enough detective shows to recognize the hallmarks of an operation running under duress, the broken routine, the anxious messenger, the anonymous phone number. Whatever was happening beneath the surface of these envelope exchanges, it had escalated beyond simple message passing. He considered calling the number, but could not imagine what he would say. He considered destroying the card, but worried about the consequences if these people returned, and discovered he had discarded their contact information. He slipped the card into his wallet, where it remained for the next 4 weeks, a piece of damning evidence he could neither use nor discard. The regular pattern never resumed. On 3 subsequent Tuesdays, the man in the charcoal coat failed to appear. The woman in the navy raincoat came once more in late January, but when Michael explained he had no envelope to provide, she left immediately without the usual transaction, her face betraying the first genuine emotion he had witnessed from either of them, a flicker of concern, quickly masked. By February, the visits ceased entirely. Michael continued working his graveyard shifts, restocking shelves and mopping floors, but now with a persistent sense of unease that transformed every customer entering after midnight into a potential threat. He found himself studying faces, memorizing license plates, developing the paranoid vigilance of someone who knows they have witnessed something significant, but lacks the context to understand what or why. The FBI came to the 7-Eleven on March 11, 1986, at 3:30 a.m. during Michael's shift. 2 men in dark suits, badges held out for inspection, expressions professionally neutral. Special Agent Thomas Carver and Special Agent Robert Hirsch from the FBI's Washington Field Office, Counterintelligence Division. They asked Michael to describe everyone who had been in the store that night. They asked if anyone had left packages or envelopes. They asked if Michael had noticed any regular customers who came at unusual hours. Michael answered truthfully, describing the ordinary parade of insomniacs and third-shift workers, mentioning nothing about the envelopes. He told himself this omission was not lying, merely caution, but the rationalization felt hollow even as he constructed it. The agents thanked him for his cooperation, left their business cards, legitimate cards this time, embossed with the FBI seal, and departed. Michael watched their car sit in the parking lot for 45 minutes after the interview, the agents visible as silhouettes against the dashboard lights, clearly conducting surveillance, observing who entered and left the store. When they finally drove away, heading north on Wisconsin Avenue, Michael retrieved the anonymous business card from his wallet and stared at it for 20 minutes, thumb hovering over the phone receiver, before returning the card to its place without making a call. What Michael could not have known was that the FBI had been conducting a parallel investigation codenamed Glass Hammer, tracking the same Soviet intelligence network from a different angle. In November 1985, a CIA officer named Eric Sanderson had walked into the FBI's Washington Field Office and reported that he had been approached by Soviet intelligence at a diplomatic reception, an approach so subtle and professional that he had nearly missed its significance. Over the following months, Sanderson had cooperated with the FBI in a controlled operation, pretending to consider the recruitment, while FBI analysts mapped the network's communication patterns and identified key nodes in the operation. The investigation had identified the woman in the Navy raincoat as Elena Morozova, a second secretary at the Soviet embassy whose diplomatic status provided immunity from prosecution, but whose activities could still be documented and used for expulsion. The man in the charcoal coat had proven more elusive surveillance teams had lost him twice in the maze of Maryland suburbs, and his identity remained unknown to investigators. By February 1986, the operation was reaching critical mass, with FBI officials debating whether to roll up the network immediately or allow it to continue running in hopes of identifying additional agents and sources. The 7-Eleven on Wisconsin Avenue had appeared in surveillance logs as a location of interest, a site where Elena Morozova had been observed on multiple occasions, but the FBI had not yet connected the store to the broader communication network. The interview with Michael Chun was a fishing expedition, an attempt to develop additional leads before the operation moved to its endgame. Michael's decision not to mention the envelopes would haunt him for the next 37 years. In the immediate aftermath of the FBI visit, he convinced himself that his silence protected him from unknown consequences, that revealing his participation, however unwitting and innocent, would somehow transform him from witness to suspect. He constructed elaborate justifications. He had committed no crime. The FBI had not asked specifically about envelopes. His information was likely irrelevant to their investigation anyway. But beneath these rationalizations lived a darker truth. He had accepted money for services he knew were questionable, had participated in a pattern of behavior that common sense suggested was not innocent, had ignored warning signs that should have prompted immediate cooperation with authorities. He had been paid for his silence, and having accepted that payment, he now felt bound to maintain it even after the payment stopped. The network collapsed in April 1986. Though Michael learned the details only years later through newspaper accounts and declassified documents that eventually made their way into the public record. Elena Morozova was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States on April 15th, boarding an Aeroflot flight to Moscow from Dulles International Airport, while FBI agents photographed her departure for intelligence files. The man in the charcoal coat was eventually identified as Viktor Chikov, a KGB officer operating under non-official cover, posing as a freelance consultant for international trade firms. He fled the country on April 12th, 3 days before the expulsion order for Morozova became public, apparently tipped off by someone within the Soviet embassy, who recognized the pattern of FBI activity indicating an imminent takedown. 3 American citizens were arrested and charged with espionage. 2 Department of Defense analysts who had provided classified satellite imagery to Soviet handlers, and a State Department translator who had compromised diplomatic cable traffic for 18 months. All 3 were convicted at trial and received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in federal prison. The investigation revealed a network that had compromised significant intelligence over a 3-year period, including information about American early warning systems, NATO defense planning, and classified details about covert operations in Central America and Afghanistan. Michael Chun was never charged, never called to testify, never contacted again by the FBI or any other law enforcement agency. The investigation files, eventually declassified in part under Freedom of Information Act requests filed by journalists, and historians in the late 1990s make no mention of the 7-Eleven or its graveyard shift clerk. The FBI had identified other communication nodes in the network, a bookstore in Alexandria that served a similar function, a parking garage in Georgetown where dead drops were serviced, a restaurant in DuPont Circle where brief encounters occurred during lunch hours, and these locations received the focus of prosecutorial attention. Michael's role, such as it was, remained invisible to history, a footnote that never made it into the official record. He quit the 7-Eleven in May 1986, citing a desire to return to university studies, though in truth he could no longer endure the graveyard shift with its oppressive silence and shadows that seemed to conceal watching eyes. He found work as a hotel night auditor, then as a data entry clerk for an insurance company, eventually building a career in information technology that provided comfortable middle-class stability. He married in 1991, divorced in 1999, remarried in 2004. He had 2 children who grew into adults without ever hearing the story of their father's brief involvement in Cold War espionage. He moved from Maryland to Virginia, from Virginia to North Carolina, from North Carolina to Georgia, each relocation carrying him further from the amber-lit parking lot and fluorescent interior of that Wisconsin Avenue convenience store. The anonymous business card remained in his wallet for 7 years, before he finally threw it away during a move to a new apartment in Arlington. By then the phone number was certainly disconnected, the operation long since dismantled, the danger passed into memory. But the act of discarding the card brought no relief, no sense of closure. He had carried it like a talisman, a reminder of the night when everything had shifted, when the pattern broke, and he had glimpsed the machinery operating beneath the surface of ordinary life. Throwing it away felt like attempting to discard memory itself, and futile gesture toward forgetting what could never be forgotten. In 2011, Michael Chun read a Washington Post article about declassified Soviet intelligence documents that provided new details about KGB operations in the United States during the 1980s. The article mentioned Glass Window by name, described its communication methods, and the network of cutouts used to prevent direct contact between handlers and sources. The article quoted a former KGB officer now living in Moscow under his real name and trading Soviet-era secrets for book advances and television appearances, who described the network as eyes, elegant in its simplicity operating for years beneath FBI notice until a single recruitment attempt gone wrong compromised the entire operation. The article mentioned the 7-Eleven obliquely, describing commercial establishments used as message drops, but provided no specific addresses or identifying details. Michael read the article 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table in suburban Atlanta, while his second wife prepared dinner and cable news played on the television in the living room. He felt the decades collapse, felt himself standing again behind that counter, holding a white envelope, watching a man in a charcoal coat walk back into the October darkness. He thought about the FBI agents who had interviewed him, professional and courteous, seeking information he had possessed, but chose not to provide. He thought about the 3 Americans who had gone to prison, who had sat in federal cells while he went about his ordinary life, building a career, raising a family, achieving the unremarkable success that defined so many American lives. He thought about the Soviet intelligence officer now comfortable in Moscow, monetizing his memories for Western audiences hungry for Cold War drama. He thought about all the information that had been compromised, all the operations potentially betrayed, all the consequences that rippled outward from those sealed white envelopes he had held in his hands for 48 hours before passing them onward. That night, Michael Chun nearly called the FBI tip line. He drafted an email to the Washington field office, explaining his role, providing dates and descriptions, offering to testify or provide a statement for the historical record. He wrote and deleted 3 different versions, each iteration struggling to balance confession with self-justification, to explain how an ordinary person could make such calculations, could weigh personal risk against civic duty and choose silence. In the end, he deleted the final draft and closed his laptop, telling himself that the information was too old to matter, that the principles were dead or beyond reach, that his testimony would serve no useful purpose except to salve his own conscience at the expense of his reputation and family peace. These were the same rationalizations he had constructed 25 years earlier, refined and polished through decades of repetition, no more true now than they had been then. Michael Chun died in 2022 at age 60 from complications following cardiac surgery. His obituary, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, described a loving father, devoted husband, and successful IT professional who enjoyed golf and volunteered with local youth programs. The obituary made no mention of convenience stores, sealed envelopes, or the autumn of 1985, when ordinary life intersected with Cold War espionage in a fluorescent-lit retail space on Wisconsin Avenue in Bethesda, Maryland. The Soviet intelligence network, designated Glass Window, was one of dozens operated during the Cold War's final decade, a small node in an immense apparatus that spanned continents and consumed thousands of lives in its machinery. KGB operations in the United States during this period operated under constant pressure, aware that American counterintelligence capabilities had evolved significantly since the spy scandals of the 1960s and 1970s. FBI's Washington field office maintained dozens of active counterintelligence investigations simultaneously, tracking Soviet diplomats, monitoring known intelligence officers, attempting to identify deep cover operatives who lived under assumed identities for years or decades. The game was sophisticated on both sides: surveillance and counter-surveillance, dead drops and brush passes, encrypted communications and one-time cipher pads. All the tradecraft developed and refined through 40 years of continuous covert conflict. The use of cutouts like Michael Chun represented standard Soviet methodology, creating breaks in the chain that made it nearly impossible for FBI surveillance teams to connect handlers directly to sources without months or years of patient observation and documentation. The 3 Americans convicted in the case were released after serving their sentences, emerging into a world transformed beyond recognition from the one they had betrayed. The Iron Curtain had fallen. The Berlin Wall existed only in museum fragments. The Soviet Union itself had dissolved into 15 separate nations, and the KGB had been restructured and renamed and reformed in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1986. The intelligence that had seemed so valuable in 1985 satellite reconnaissance data, NATO contingency planning, diplomatic cable traffic had been rendered obsolete by geopolitical shifts that neither American nor Soviet analysts had predicted with any accuracy. The younger generation, raised in a world of internet connectivity and global commerce, struggled to comprehend the paranoia and secrecy that had defined their parents' era, the sense that invisible wars were being fought in every city, that trust itself was a weapon that could be turned against you. Michael Chun's role in this history was utterly minimal, a temporary custodian of communications, an unwitting participant compensated with money, it seemed. Significant then, but amounted to perhaps $2,000 total, less than a month's rent in the rent in an modest suburban apartment where he lived during those months. Yet his decision not to cooperate with the FBI, to maintain silence when he possessed information that might have been valuable, reflected a larger pattern that enabled such networks to function. Intelligence operations succeeded not through the recruitment of committed ideologues, willing to risk everything for belief, but through the quiet cooperation of ordinary people willing to look away, to accept simple explanations, to value personal safety over civic responsibility. The vast majority of people who enabled espionage never considered themselves spies, never believed they were doing anything truly wrong, never imagined that their small contributions might aggregate into significant damage. They were merely trying to survive, to make rent, to avoid complications. They were trying to live ordinary lives in circumstances that demanded extraordinary moral clarity. The Cold War was fought and won not through dramatic confrontations or military victories, but through thousands of small decisions made by ordinary people in unremarkable places. It was fought in 7-Eleven stores and parking garages and restaurant booths, in the quiet hours when witnesses were few and consequences seemed abstract. It was fought by people like Michael Chun, who stood behind counters and held sealed envelopes and chose silence over revelation, comfort over risk. These were not evil people. They were not monsters or traitors. They were simply human, with all the moral fragility and self-interested calculation that humanity entails. The architecture of espionage depended fundamentally on this human dimension, on the willingness of ordinary individuals to make compromises, to accept rationalizations, to prioritize immediate personal concerns over abstract civic duties. Intelligence officers on both sides understood this psychology intimately, knew how to calibrate their approaches, how much money to offer, how to frame participation in ways that minimized cognitive dissonance. $20 for holding an envelope overnight seemed insignificant, hardly different from holding a package for a neighbor. Only later, in retrospect, did the full moral weight of such participation become clear, and by then the choices had been made, the compromises accepted, the silence established. The 7-Eleven on Wisconsin Avenue closed in 1994, replaced by a CVS pharmacy that now occupies the entire strip mall footprint. The amber sodium vapor streetlights had been upgraded to LED fixtures that cast harsh white illumination across the expanded parking lot. The interstate highway that once formed a boundary 3 blocks away has been widened and restructured, pushing development northward into what were once quiet suburbs. Nothing remains of the store where Michael Chun worked his graveyard shifts, where sealed envelopes changed hands beneath fluorescent lights, where ordinary commerce concealed Cold War espionage. The location is utterly transformed, erased, forgotten by everyone, except the few individuals who carry those memories like unopened letters, sealed forever, their contents known only to those who lived through moments that history chose not to record. In the end, perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Cold War. Not the dramatic confrontations preserved in textbooks and documentary films, but the 10,000 invisible compromises made by ordinary people in circumstances they did not fully understand, choices that seemed insignificant at the time, but aggregated into the massive apparatus that defined an era. Michael Chun made $80 per week for 2 months, holding envelopes for strangers, and carried the weight of that choice for the rest of his life. Whether his burden was deserved, whether his guilt was proportional to his actual contribution to the damage done, whether he should have confessed or remained silent, these questions have no clear answers, no resolution that satisfies both legal obligation and human understanding. They remain, like those sealed white envelopes, unopened and unreadable, carried through time by people who cannot quite bring themselves to discard them, but who have long since forgotten why they seemed so important to keep.